Once again, thank you guys all so much for joining us this evening. We are very excited to be able to present the Women of the Montgomery Bus Boycott. This is presented by Madeline Burkhart of the Rosa Parks Museum at Troy University, Montgomery. And so I had the opportunity to work with Madeline on the Taste of History series that we did. So I'm very excited to welcome her back for the Lombard Historical Society. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen and pass it over to Madeline.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. Let me get, okay, cool. Alrighty. I have jumped ahead a little bit on here. Then play. You would think I would be used to, I keep saying this in like every presentation, after a whole year, you would think I'd be used to. Can y'all see my screen or the PowerPoint? Okay, cool. I had an issue the other day where it was not pulling up. So, all right, good. So thank you so much for having me again. This is one of my favorite things to talk about because so many people just know Rosa Parks from the Montgomery Bus Boycott, and they don't realize that there were so many other women involved. Really, the names you associate with the Montgomery Bus Boycott are Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King Jr., and then Ralph D. Abernathy. Some people may know E.D. Nixon as well, but it's really Rosa Parks that people know, and now Claudette Colvin, which is great too, and I'll talk about her a little bit too. But I am actually going to start off with Rosa Parks a little bit, just to give you a little bit more background on her, because she was a woman of the Montgomery Bus Boycott, but she also did so much more in her life, and that's something that really isn't touched on too much. So Rosa Louise Macaulay Parks was born on February 4th, 1913 in Tuskegee, Alabama, and when she was young, her family moved to Pine Level, Alabama. Her grandparents were enslaved and often told her stories of their life before freedom, and this helped shape her beliefs. So from a very, very early age, she was getting all of this education and history and knowledge on what it meant to be free and to have that kind of freedom. Her grandfather would often sit at their front door of their house, especially during the Red Summer of 1919, which was a summer when the Ku Klux Klan was especially active. And he was always sitting at the front door armed with a shotgun because they lived in fear that the KKK may come and harm them. She grew up protecting herself and her brother in their highly segregated town. One time, when a white man was threatening her, she picked up a brick and dared him to come closer. She said that she would rather be lynched than live to be mistreated, which, again, this is very life, and it's something that I really like on her. A lot of people, and a lot of times like history books portray her as this elderly, meek woman who was just tired after a long day of work, but she was not. She knew what she was doing, and she was a bit of a spitfire from a very early age. Then after that incident, when she was in her late teens, there was a white neighbor of her employer's who sexually assaulted her, but she resisted and eventually warded him off. And this experience shaped the causes she stood for later in life. A lot of historians have said that this one kind of moment where she was sexually assaulted and harassed really helped shape her into the sexual assault investigator she became later on for the NAACP. However, Rosa Parks herself has never really confirmed any of this, but there are enough scholars and historians that have kind of said it, but we think maybe she was just not as public with that part of her life, I guess is the best way to say it. Like, she kept that a little bit more private. And she absolutely hated how Black women were used and abused by white men only for their pleasure. Soon after that, she met her husband, Raymond Parks, and this was her first encounter with a true activist who was out in the streets protesting and everything. He told her of the Scottsboro Boys case, which he was an organizer for, and he was helping to raise money for their defense fund. And if you're not familiar with the Scottsboro Boys case, it is a case from northern Alabama, and it's where 9 young men from the ages of 12 to 19 had been wrongfully accused of raping 2 white women on a train and sentenced to death. And Rosa eventually became an activist for them as well. And move on for a little later in her life. In 1943, Rosa became involved in the Montgomery chapter of the NAACP. She would eventually become its secretary and the sexual assault investigator that I mentioned just a few minutes ago. From 1943 to 1945, she helped shape the Voters League to ensure Black people were registered to vote and that they would be able to get to the polls, which of course was extremely difficult during that time. In 1944, a Black woman named Reese Taylor was gang raped by 6 white men while walking home from church in Abbeville, Alabama. Taylor reported the crime to the police, but they did nothing. The NAACP sent Rosa over 100 miles to meet Reese Taylor and take down her testimony, so someone would have a record of what had happened to her. Rosa and other members of the NAACP worked diligently to draw attention to this case and asked the governor to call for a special grand jury. This specific case received nationwide attention, but of course, nothing happened. She became involved in many other sexual assault cases during her time with the NAACP, but this one's probably the Reese Taylor case is the one that's most famous. And if any of you all are interested in her work as a sexual assault investigator or the Reese Taylor case specifically, there's a book called At the Dark End of the Street that is really well done. Of course, like a content warning for it because it does deal with sexual assault and rape. In 1954, she helped rejuvenate a local youth council and helped organize them to challenge segregation directly through public protests and letters to Washington. She loved working with the youth and kids. She saw them as the future, which they are. I mean, they are the ones who are going to become leaders later on. And so she really wanted them to understand what their rights are and how to use their voice for good, and that no age is too young to speak up. One person that was actually in her youth council was Claudette Colvin, who I'll mention a little later. In the summer of 1955, where this photo is taken, Rosa Parks attended Highlander Folk School in Monteagle, Tennessee. And Highlander held integrated training classes around social change, and they specialized in nonviolence training. When she returned from Highlander, there was a speaker on Dexter Avenue, which is the main street downtown in Montgomery, who was talking about Emmett Till's murder and his killer's acquittal in Mississippi. And many people have contributed this event as the motivation for Mrs. Parks refusing to give up her seat. She has even said that in a couple of letters, that because she had just so recently heard of Emmett Till's case, that he was fresh on her mind in December when she, was sitting there and was like, I cannot allow this to keep happening. I have to do something. So his case was really crucial for her refusing to give up her seat. And there was actually a similar case to Emmett Till's that happened in Montgomery, but it just didn't receive as much publicity. So the famous December 1st, 1955, which is what Rosa Parks is most known for. This was a typical day of work for her. She was about a block and a half from where she would get arrested and working as a seamstress at the Montgomery Fair department store. She began her journey home when she boarded the Cleveland Avenue bus, and she lived on Cleveland Avenue, which is now Rosa Parks Avenue if you happen to visit Montgomery. She took a vacant seat in the middle section, which was permissible by law for paying Black passengers. After the next couple of stops, all the seats were filled with one white man left standing in the aisle. And according to city ordinances, Black passengers were not supposed to be able to ask to relinquish their seats if another seat was not available. However, this bus driver, James Blake, who was known for being very confrontational and very nasty, ordered all Black passengers in the middle section to move to what was known as the colored section in the back of the bus. And of course, as everyone knows, Mrs. Parks remained seated. Blake repeated his demand, to which she responded with that firm but courageous no. He said he was going to call the police, and then she said, "You may do that," and she kept sitting. She was arrested and officially charged with refusing to obey orders of the bus driver. And because bus drivers were kind of allowed to act as this official authority then, and could make kind of the rules when they were on there. A lot of people think that she was planted on the bus on December 1st, and maybe that has something to do with how well the bus boycott was planned and how almost effortlessly it seemed to move on through those 382 days. But we go off of what Mrs. Parks herself has stated, and that's just simply not true. There were a lot of cases before hers where women and men refused to give up their seats. And so there was already kind of talk happening on, we need to boycott this bus and we just need the right person to do it. So because of Rosa Parks's work with the NAACP and her being well known in the community, it was just kind of like this perfect storm of events on December 1st. And they finally decided, all right, this is it, we're going to move on. And of course, that one action of hers would make her known as the mother of the modern day civil rights movement. And a lot of people, again, don't realize that she was very active in other things after the bus boycott. It wasn't just like a one and done thing on December 1st. But her and her husband, they had to move to Detroit in 1957, so very soon after the boycott ended, to be with other members of her family because her life was threatened and she just couldn't find work anywhere. Her family quickly fell into poverty because of this, but while in Detroit, she still remained an activist. She protested housing segregation, participated in Detroit's Great March for Freedom, and attended the March on Washington in August 1963 as part of the Women's March on Washington. During that famous march, Dr. King and a lot of others didn't think that it was safe for the women to march with them. So of course, sexism is very alive and well now, it was then too. So Rosa Parks and some other women helped head up this march all the way up to Washington. She did come back down to Alabama a couple of times, but also she came back down for the march, the Voting Rights March in Selma in 1965. While in Detroit, she worked as an aide for Congressman John Conyers for over 20 years, and then she later opened the Rosa and Raymond Parks Institute for Self-Development in 1987 to carry on her work with youth. And we have a wing of the museum called the Children's Wing, which is named after her advocacy for kids. It's not necessarily like an interactive, super immersive experience for kids, just for her passion that they become the future leaders. She retired from working with Congressman Conyers in 1988 and became a huge supporter of Planned Parenthood and actually served on their board for a while. And she also vocally opposed apartheid and met with Nelson Mandela. So that's a little bit more on Rosa Parks and some other issues that she was passionate about. Do y'all have any questions at all? Rosa?
I say there have been no questions, but if you have any at any point throughout the presentation, feel free to put them in the chat because I am monitoring the chat during this.
Yeah, and if I need to repeat something too, let me know. I realize I was talking a little fast and it's probably from the amount of caffeine I've had today. So I'll try to slow down too. All right, so now we're going to move into some of the, I guess, lesser known women of the Montgomery Bus Boycott. Oh wait, is there a chat question?
There is. So
Okay.
Jennifer McAllister, she does say thanks for the presentation. She wants to know, was Rosa Parks' husband supportive of her bus boycott and protest activities?
Yes, very much so. He loved having her. Well, I mean, he was worried about her, obviously, because it was so dangerous then, as it is now with, fighting for rights and standing up for what you believe in. Back then, the Klan was very, very openly active and would bomb houses and things like that. So he worried about her, but he also knew that she was kind of the right woman for the job. So he didn't want to ever take that away from her, and he stayed active in the background and fully supported her. But yeah, definitely worried about her. And kind of, I think at first was like, is there no one else that can be the face for this? Are you sure you want to do it? Because that was a whole conversation that they had at their house after she was arrested. Thank you for the question. But yeah, fully supported by her husband, which is very, very amazing. That sometimes doesn't happen. All right, any others before we move on? All right, so the first of 4 women that I'm going to talk about are the ones who made up the case for Browder versus Gale, which is the case that overturned bus segregation. One thing that's really interesting about overturning bus segregation in Montgomery was, yes, you could sit wherever you wanted to on the buses now, but to get on an integrated bus in Montgomery, Alabama, you still had to stand at a segregated bus stop. So nothing else became integrated, which, I never thought of that. Like, surely if you were getting on an integrated bus, like the bus stops themselves wouldn't still be segregated, but they were. And Rosa Parks was not a plaintiff on this case, so she was kind of solely that social movement figurehead, while these 4 women handled really the legal side of things. And from left to right on the screen, you have Aurelia Browder, and then Claudette Colvin, Mary Louise Smith, and then Susie McDonald. While the bus boycott was going on, of course, you have the boycott happening. And then in order to have lasting change, you have to have this legal side of things. And so on February 1st, 1956, just a few months after the boycott started, civil rights attorney Fred Gray filed a lawsuit in the federal district court challenging the constitutionality of the city's segregated buses. So these women, Aurelia Browder, who was 39, Claudette Colvin, 15, Mary Louise Smith, who was 18, and Susie McDonald, who was 77, so women of all ages, were all plaintiffs in this Browder versus Gale case, with the Montgomery mayor, William A. Gale, as the defendant. Another woman named Janetta Reeves was also supposed to be one of the plaintiffs, but because of the amount of death threats she received, she actually pulled out of doing so because, again, this is known as a very peaceful movement, but I like to remind people that it was very peaceful on one side of things. The violent side doesn't get talked about too much, but there was a lot of violence going on, with people throwing rocks at people's houses, acid getting poured on cars, of course, cross burnings happening, bombings at people's homes, things like that were happening. So I don't blame her at all for pulling out. Thurgood Marshall and other NAACP attorneys aided Fred Gray, and Fred Gray is still a practicing attorney in Tuskegee, Alabama to this day, if you need any civil rights help. The Middle District Court of Alabama ruled that bus segregation was actually unconstitutional, which I never would have realized, because that's pretty progressive for that time period, and especially for Alabama. But Gale, of course, Mayor Gale, was upset over that ruling, so he decided to appeal the case. And this case kept going up and up, where it reached the Supreme Court, where it was overturned. I see I probably have questions. Are there any questions?
I say there are no questions at this time.
Never mind. Okay, awesome. All right. So I'm going out of order a little bit from the way the pictures were laid out on that screen, just because so many people are aware of Claudette Colvin now, which rightfully so. I've heard people say she was the first person to refuse to give up her seat. That's not true. I mean, yes, she did it before Rosa Parks, but she wasn't the first person to do that. There were quite a few others who did it before her, and in other cities too. And so that's her photo on the right. And then on the left, I have a document from our collection that is the police report on the matter of Claudette Colvin. This is page 2, and there's a reason I brought that up on here, which I'll say in just a second. In March of 1955, Claudette Colvin was just 15 years old, and she was arrested for refusing to give up her seat on the Montgomery City bus. So again, months before Rosa Parks. And the reason I have this police record here is because it is one of the most disturbing things in our collection. We don't have too much of a collection. We have a lot of police records, and we have Rosa Parks' fingerprints, and we have a bus and a car, and that's about it. But this one, when we were going through digitizing it, when I started working there almost 6 years ago, I was reading through everything, and this one bothered me the most because up at the top, you have this quote that reads that the police officer said, where he said, "There's that thing over there. I've had trouble out of her before." And this one quote out of everything in our collection really, really shows the blatant use of dehumanizing terms by those in power that towards those that they did not perceive to be their equals. This dehumanization of Black people and other people of color was not and is not specific to the civil rights movement. But I always like to point it out because it's so obviously a dehumanizing term. Not there's the woman over there, there's the girl over there, there she is, like nothing like that. It is there's that thing over there. And in Claudette Colvin's account and another bus rider's account, Claudette repeatedly shouted, "It's my constitutional right to stay in my seat," which at 15, I would have had absolutely no idea that that was something I should say, or was that staying in my seat would be a constitutional right. I think some of that came from her working with that youth council, and she knew what her rights were, which is amazing. She was arrested. So on that ride to the police station, the officers made very inappropriate comments about her body. They took turns guessing her bra size. And again, this is a 15-year-old young woman. And if you would like to read more about her treatment by the officers, there is a thesis, I believe, yes, by Samantha Gordon. Her thesis is called "Power Dynamics of a Segregated City, Class, Gender, and Claudette Colvin's Struggle for Equality." Claudette Colvin was charged with disturbing the peace, violating segregation laws, and assault and battery of a police officer. However, that latter one was charged with no evidence except for a letter written by a white male who witnessed the arrest. It's unclear whether he witnessed it from on the bus or from the sidewalk, like across the street, like peering into the bus, but nevertheless it is. In his letter, he commends the police officers for being gentlemanly almost to the point of turning the other cheek, and that they only use the proper amount of force necessary. This account is obviously contradictory to what Claudette Colvin and her classmates recounted, and you can read more about what they said happened in a 2005 article called Unsung Hero Paved Way for Parks in the Huntsville Times, which is a newspaper from Northern Alabama. And as historians, we can only rely on the statements provided by those involved, including, I guess, the white male who somewhere somehow witnessed what happened. But while we have those, we must remember that those reports were often skewed in favor of those who were in power and usually who is the oppressor in the situation. History has always been written by those who win and who have the means to do so and who end up being in power. So this 15-year-old woman was violated, but her charges identify her as the abuser instead of the officers. And this suspicion comes from fear, but fear is only an excuse for a bigger problem. And 66 years later, we find ourselves still dealing with the same issues that she faced then. Another thing I'll mention about her is a lot of people ask, why Rosa Parks? Why not Claudette Colvin? Again, she was very young, so she was 15. So that's, not in her favor. She got pregnant out of wedlock soon after the incident. So she wasn't pregnant when she was arrested, but soon after she got pregnant by an older man out of wedlock. And she had the assault and battery charge. And also, I always hate saying this, but because her skin was darker than Rosa Parks's, and because she was from an area of town that wasn't considered the good part of town, they didn't think that she would be a good figurehead for the movement. So they wanted to wait until someone who had a better, reputation and better relationship with the community, both the Black community and the white community in Montgomery, to step up. On to Joan Robinson. A lot of people have not heard of her, and I think I'm getting into the ones who people have really not heard of right now, but she is the one who really made the boycott happen. She was a professor at Alabama State College, which is now Alabama State University in Montgomery, and she became active in what was called the Women's Political Council, or WPC. This was a local civic organization for African American professional women that was dedicated to fostering women's involvement in civic affairs, increasing voter registration in the city's Black community, and aiding women who were victims of rape and assault. She wasn't native to Montgomery, but soon after arriving, she was verbally attacked by a public bus driver for sitting in the whites only section of the bus. When she became the Women's Political Council's president the following year, she made desegregating the city's buses one of the organization's top priorities. In a letter to Mayor W.A. Gale, who is on the Browder versus Gale case, in May of 1954, Robinson and the Women's Political Council urged the mayor to correct the behavior towards African Americans on Montgomery's buses, or the Black community would boycott. So this is a solid year and a half before the boycott actually happened. They're already kind of warning them that this is coming if something doesn't happen. Upon the arrest of Rosa Parks on December 1st, 1955, Joan Robinson authored a flyer calling for a one-day boycott of the city buses. And that's what's attached on here by her photo, is what the flyer said. It is kind of hard to read. She and her friend and colleague, John Cannon, who is chair for the business department at Alabama State College, and two trusted senior students assisted her in making over 50,000 copies of the flyers on a mimeograph machine. And a mimeograph machine is kind of the ancestor to the copier machine. And there were some mimeograph machines that were electric during that time that you could plug in and they would spit them out, like what we're used to now. Theirs did not. So they had the actual hand crank ones. And so they were cranking out over 50,000 flyers into the dead of night, and doing so in secret because she could lose her position or worse if they were found out. These flyers were distributed all throughout the Black community and were an instrumental communication device aiding in the success of the boycott. Joan Robinson she chose not to accept an official Montgomery Improvement Association position for fear of jeopardizing her job at Alabama State, but she worked behind the scenes as a member of the Montgomery Improvement Association's executive board. She wrote and edited their weekly newspaper and volunteered in the carpool system that helped everyone get to and from work. And the Montgomery Improvement Association was started during the boycott, right at the beginning of it, and it's still active to this day. And it's an organization that is concerned with social change in the city. First president was someone everyone probably knows. Dr. King was the Montgomery Improvement Association's first president, and their current president is the pastor at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Reverend Handy, and that is the church where Dr. King was a pastor when he was in Montgomery. In Dr. King's memoir of the boycott, Stride Towards Freedom, he said of Robinson that she, perhaps more than any other person, was active on every level of this protest. She was so well known, and as well known as Dr. King, Edie Nixon, Rosa Parks, and others, that police officers were throwing stones through her windows, they were pouring acid on her car, and it got so bad that Alabama's governor ordered the state police to guard her home and then other people's homes. So the governor actually had to intervene because of the violence that was going on at her house. And of course, Dr. King's house too. Okay. Any questions so far? Nope. All right. All right. So Georgia Gilmore she's another one of those very feisty women from the Montgomery Bus Boycott. There's a really great children's book about her. If any of you all are in the market for kids' books, it's called Pies from Nowhere. I'll explain what that means in just a minute, but it's really well done. And I like that it highlights, someone who people don't really know about. Georgia Gilmore was a lifelong resident of Montgomery, Alabama, In October of 1955, after paying her fare on a city bus, the driver ordered her to get off the bus and reboard from the rear. So at the time, if you were not a white passenger, you would still have to enter in through the front of the bus to pay your fare, but you couldn't just walk down the aisle to your seat. They would make you get back off the bus and enter in from that rear entrance. And a lot of times, which is what happened with Georgia Gilmore, if the driver was in the mood, they would just drive off and leave people there after they paid their fare. And that is exactly what happened to Georgia Gilmore. And at that moment, she decided to never ride the buses in Montgomery again. In February of 1956, which this actually happened very recently, so the end of February 1956, there were arrest warrants issued for about 89 of the leaders of the Montgomery bus boycott. They were to be arrested following a 1921 statute that stated that it was illegal to boycott without just cause. So they didn't see this racism, I guess, as a just cause for a boycott. So they were to be arrested. That statute does not exist anymore, thankfully. However, I feel like I can say this because we just made a post on social media about it. In Alabama, a House bill just passed yesterday that is eerily similar to that one, because it determines who and what protesters are and who is a peaceful protester and who is not. And it's all up to the police on that. So it's eerily similar. And all around the same time is, just 66 years later from this one, Dr. King was indicted for it. The others were not actually convicted, but Dr. King was indicted. And at his grand jury trial, Gilmore was among those who testified on his behalf. Someone named the late Reverend Al Dixon said that everyone could tell you that Georgia Gilmore didn't take no junk. You pushed her too far, she would say a few bad words. You pushed her any further and she would hit you, which I really love that. She brought that fighting spirit to the courtroom, and she fearlessly denounced the white bus driver who had kicked her off a city bus from the witness stand. She said, "When I paid my fare and they got the money, they don't know Negro money from white money." And she told that to the judge, which, very true. Because of her defending King, she lost her job as a cook at the National Lunch Company. Though some historians aren't sure if she was actually fired or if she resigned, just knowing that her testimony would lead to her being fired. So she may have just left before that could happen. Dr. King, of course, was very thankful to her for doing this, and he lived a few blocks fan of her cooking and of her activism. When he was fired from her restaurant job, he just asked her, "Well, why don't you go into business for yourself?" So she did. And with Dr. King's support, Georgia Gilmore turned her house into an informal restaurant. She opened a catering business and home restaurant with the help and financial backing of Dr. King and others. She, along with many other Black women, formed clubs and prepared meals for protesters and others. Gilmore's network of female bakers were called the Club from Nowhere, because whenever police officers or others would ask Gilmore where they were getting the money from, she said, "Nowhere." Club leaders presented all of these cash donations at the weekly mass meetings to help fund the Montgomery bus boycott. So you still had the mass meetings being held weekly in the churches, and that was where they really collected a lot of the funds for the boycott. But also after the February 1956 mass arrest incident, that became national as well as international news. And so money started actually pouring in from other places around the country. So that helped. The culinary skills of Georgia Gilmore and other women sustained thousands upon thousands upon thousands of protesters for the full 382 days of the Montgomery bus boycott. So we're talking, I don't know if people are familiar with the numbers from the boycott, but there are about, I want to say like 100,000 people who lived in Montgomery at that time, and it was pretty evenly split, half and half. So you're talking of over 50,000 people probably who were protesting around that time, or around 50,000. So they're right on the money with the flyer count. Oh, great. This is going to be brief on these women, but from left to right, we have Lucille Times, Juanita Abernathy, and then of course Coretta Scott King, who is very famous. Lucille Times had an incident where she was driving her own personal vehicle, and a bus driver kept trying to drive her off the road and push her off the road. And, you know, in addition to that being very unsafe, it made her very, very angry. So she wanted in on this boycott soon after and started calling for a boycott a little before it actually began. And she became a huge supporter of it throughout the whole 382 days. And she helped drive a lot of those carpools during that time because she did have her own personal vehicle. So she would help out with that. She passed away, I want to say it was last year or the year before. So just she was with us for a very long time. Juanita Abernathy in the middle, she was Ralph D. Abernathy's wife, and Ralph D. Abernathy is kind of known as being the right-hand man of Dr. King and his best friend. Juanita Abernathy, even though she was working very much so behind the scenes, she's credited as making kind of the business model for sustaining the boycott with all of the money that was coming in, because they were buying cars, they had to buy insurance, they had to, of course, do maintenance on the cars and other things like that. And she also is credited as for creating that carpooling system that was super intricate. There were a few, I think about a dozen or so, probably more than that, carpool pickup locations in Montgomery. And it really ran like the bus transit system or any other kind of transit system. You would go to, say, E.L. Posey parking lot, which is in downtown Montgomery. And by going there, you knew that the cars leaving that lot would go maybe somewhere on Cleveland Avenue. So you knew exactly which stop to get at and whose car to get in at whatever stop, which was just, it sounds very complicated, and we can thank her for that. And then Coretta Scott King, again, she is more known for her activism after the Montgomery bus boycott, not so much during, like she was there, but not as in the front as Rosa Parks and Georgia Gilmore and others. But she said later in life that this boycott really taught her, you know, it put her through the fire and really tested her. Of course, she came out on the other side. She was there when their house was bombed on January 31st of 1956. Her husband, Dr. King, was at a mass meeting preaching, and Coretta, their newborn baby, and a woman from their church were all at their house at the parsonage. They heard a noise and they moved to the back of the house, which is insanely smart and not something I would think to do. And their front porch was completely blown up. If they hadn't moved, they would have been killed, but thankfully no one was hurt. So Coretta definitely was in the middle of all of the violence going on. Any questions so far? Nope. Okay. All right. Another question we get at the museum a lot is, were there any white supporters? And there were, not too many, but there were some. These are three of the most notable women white supporters. And from the left to right, you have Juliet Hampton Morgan, Jean Gratz, I'm going to call her Genie because I knew her personally very well, and then Virginia Juror, who is on the right. So starting with Juliet Hampton Morgan, she was born into upper class Montgomery society. People with her social status rarely ever used Montgomery public transportation, but because she suffered from severe anxiety that prevented her from driving, she always rode the city buses, and that is where she witnessed firsthand the abuses that her community suffered at the hands of the bus drivers. For the next several years, anytime Juliet Hampton Morgan witnessed abuse, she would completely disrupt the bus service. Beginning in 1939 and continuing through 1952, Morgan wrote letters to the local newspaper denouncing the injustices she continued to witness. So 1939, that is early on, very early on. 3 years before the bus boycott even, she wrote a letter to the local newspaper warning Montgomery's white citizens that African Americans were tired of staying quiet about Montgomery's Jim Crow laws and practices and that things had to change. So again, 3 years before, she's warning everyone that, a storm's a brewing. You need to make decisions now and do something. As a result of her actions and her support of Black citizens in Montgomery, she was completely shunned from society. And Montgomery's white citizens continually tried to get her removed from her post at the public library. So she was a librarian in the city. She wrote, "There are thousands who want to change our old order, but they are afraid of speaking out. I believe that is our biggest problem, overcoming the fear of decent white people." And unfortunately, because of the harassment she faced, she took her own life in 1957, 2 years after the boycott ended, a year after the boycott ended. And she left a very devastating note saying, "I am not going to cause any more trouble to anybody." Do you have any questions before I move on to Genie?
Yes, we did have one come in asking, was there any consideration to keep the carpool operational even after the bus boycott ended?
Ooh, good question. I don't think there was, just because, they had that victory and they wanted to claim that victory and really use it. Plus, even that carpooling system going was very expensive and very time consuming. So they mostly just rode the buses. And the reason that the buses were what was targeted first before segregated department stores, movie theaters, and other spaces was because Black citizens at the time said that was where they faced the most harassment, because in department stores and everywhere else, you could kind of, there were 2 different entrances for the most part, or 2 completely different buildings. And so you didn't interact with each other. But on the buses, you had no choice to. If you were getting on a bus as a African American, you would more than likely have a white bus driver, and there would more than likely be white citizens on there too. But I don't think there was too much. And the churches also ran a lot of the carpooling, the carpools that went on because they took up a lot of the offerings. So there were station wagons that they bought to hold a lot of people, and the churches would put the name of the church on there as well as the pastor's name. And these were called rolling churches that went around through town. So, here in the Bible Belt, you're going to look like a massive jerk if you were pulling over a church vehicle. So those were a little safer to be in, I believe. But also they had more money coming in, but I think it was just too expensive to keep up. And unfortunately, a lot of the sites where they were located don't exist anymore. They were usually at local Black-owned businesses or other areas that were Black-owned. I know the EL Postal lot does not exist, and I haven't actually seen a full map or anything of the system itself. So if any of you all happen to find one somehow, somewhere, we would love to have that, because we don't know if we were playing. But I think it just kind of, they wanted that victory, they got their victory, and they claimed it, and the other was just too expensive. That it's just that. Also, insurance was getting to be a problem to get to, because insurance companies here in Alabama, as well as throughout the entire nation, started to figure out what the insurance was being used for, and so they stopped issuing it. A lot of the car insurance actually came from London. Dr. King reached out to a friend in Atlanta, who then reached out to a friend in London, England, at Lloyd's of London. And Lloyd's insured a lot of the carpools during that time. And one super, super ironic fact about Lloyd's of London is they also insured most all of the slave ships that came over here. So I don't know if this is an early form of reparations. I don't know if they thought that much about it. Probably not. But, that's just like one fact that's always blown my mind. But yeah, insurance was a lot of money, and getting to be a huge hassle to get to. I think that's a good question. I don't think anyone's ever asked that. So with Genie, who's in the middle, She passed away in December of 2020, just like 4 days shy of her 90th birthday. She was here in the city because of her husband. So her husband was Reverend Robert Gratz, and he was the white pastor at an all-Black Lutheran congregation on Cleveland Avenue, which is where Rosa Parks lived. They were actually neighbors to Rosa Parks. And even though they were a white couple, they fully supported the boycott. Reverend Gratz threw himself into it. Every Sunday, he told his congregation to keep going, and he would always be there with them. So they drove a lot of the carpools. And Genie served on the Women's Political Council as well with Joan Robinson and others, and she was just very active in all facets of the movement. They were so involved that the Klan bombed their house twice. So this photo is actually from one of those bombings, and Genie is in their kitchen cleaning up all the broken glass from there. And I want to say that like Rosa Parks would come over and help clean up the glass. I think that's what her kids have told me before, because I mean, they were friends, they were neighbors. And it was kind of funny how they found out that Rosa Parks was this new figurehead, because they had heard that someone had been arrested on the bus on December 1st. And so they thought, we'll call Rosa. She always knows everything. She's in the know. And so they like dial up Rosa Parks, and they're like, hey, we heard that a woman had been arrested last night. Do you know who that was? And she's like, yeah, it was me. Like, okay, guess we're gonna roll with it then. And Genie remained very active in not just civil rights around race, but also LGBTQIA plus, women's rights, really anything that was human rights related. She was out there protesting and marching for it, really almost up until she passed away. So wonderful woman. And the only one out of these that I've been fortunate enough to meet and get to know well. To the right, we have Virginia Juror. She first developed her interest in civil rights while attending Wellesley College in the 1920s. In 1938, she co-founded the Southern Conference for Human Welfare, which was dedicated to improving social justice and civil rights, and by campaigning to repeal the poll tax. She and her lawyer husband, Clifford Juror, later befriended E.D. Nixon, Rosa Parks, and other leaders of the NAACP and Montgomery's Black community. Her husband, Clifford, was actually the one who got Rosa out of jail that evening of December 1st. Fred Gray kept trying to call up there to get her out, and the police realized who it was, and they were like, nope, not answering that call. And it wasn't until Clifford Juror, a white lawyer, called up there that they released her. So they were very active in the beginning too. And Virginia Juror also arranged for a scholarship for Rosa Parks to attend that integration workshop at Highlander Folks. That photo on, I think it was like slide 2. She was the one who made that possible for Rosa Parks. And throughout the whole boycott, Virginia Juror was a constant supporter of desegregation. She and her husband worked with the Montgomery Improvement Association and with the legal aspects to help them get better treatment, because he was a lawyer. That's what they were good at. That's their area. She continued to highlight the importance of white participation in the protests, saying, you've got to come out and help, fight for equal rights for everyone. She continued to repeal the poll tax, and her efforts with that eventually helped lead to the passing of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Which is famous. Do I have any questions so far? No? Okay. So I think that is it for the women that I have to cover. I just had a couple of photos showing women like prominently in the front. On the left is from the March on Washington in 1963, and the photo on the right is the March from Selma to Montgomery. So very active, still there. History is often written women into the background, and a civil rights movement and a lot of other things. It's just not the case. Right. And I also wanted to include some women to watch, kind of, that are in all different areas. regardless of, I guess, whatever your beliefs are, if you can find someone, some leader that you can really look up to and watch, because there are so many in, with environmental education, voting, the arts, even just every aspect of human rights, there is a woman leader somewhere, and these are just some of like the more current ones that I could think of. All right, and that is it. Do y'all have any other questions? I know I keep asking that.
Thank you so much. I mean, I know I learned a lot of new things today, and even more about what I thought I knew. So thank you so much for presenting. But yeah, as Madeline said, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat.
Or comments, concerns, anything. Anything.
I know I knew the story of the pie and the selling, but I didn't realize that it was how influential it was to funding the boycott and everything. So that was really, really interesting to hear.
Yeah, they had money coming in kind of from all areas during that time, but a lot of it was from the church or from those pies, cakes. We do have a traveling exhibition that covers specifically the women of the movement. If I'm not saying like, please take our things, but if you or anyone in the area, anyone watching this has a school, library, historical site, anywhere that would like them, we can ship them for free. You just need to let us know. We have one on Rosa Parks and her life, and then one on, like I said, the women of the movement. It's 6 panels, but they're front and back, so a total of 12. Yeah, thank you all.
That is good.
Okay.
I say if they have no other questions, I'm going to sign us off. I do want to let you know about some of the upcoming programs we have with the Historical Society. So on March 10th, we are actually having a conversation with freedom rider Thomas Armstrong III, who is local to Naperville, Illinois. His book is Autobiography of a Freedom Rider, My Life as a Foot Soldier for Civil Rights. So we're very excited to have him come and talk about his experience. And then on March, and that one will be virtual on March 10th. And then on March 24th, we are talking about America's Heroines, and that will be an in-person at the Maple Street Chapel, which is on Maple Street and Main Street in Lombard, Illinois. And all of that information can be found at our website, which is lombardhistory.org. So we've got lots of exciting things, and definitely check out, if you're ever in Montgomery, go see the Rosa Parks Museum. They've got a great website and great social media as well. So
thanks, we're trying. We're trying like everybody else. But yeah, definitely come see us. We also have rotating art exhibitions that come around every like 4 to 6 months. I'm biased because I'm the curator, but I really like the one that's in there right now. If you happen to be down between now and June 18th, it will be there. And it's more on, someone mentioned relevancy in the chat. It's definitely on like hypocrisy in religion and then in other organizations, as well as complacency and voting rights and all these things that we can connect to Rosa Parks and the civil rights movement do.
Okay, that sounds like an awesome exhibition. So once again, thank you guys all so much for joining us this evening. For those of you who are in Illinois, stay safe with all the snow that we're getting today. And for everyone else, have a wonderful rest of your evening. And I will go ahead and sign us off. Take care, everyone.